Have you ever had a near-death experience? How did that impact your day-to-day life from then on? Was your perspective forever altered, or did life simply go on and you considered yourself to be lucky? Well, the stories in today's video are about some people who escaped death by the absolute thinnest, almost unbelievable margins. And as I'm sure you'll see, it's hard to imagine how their lives could be the same afterwards. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Some people never figure out what they truly want in life and go their entire lives searching for that thing, while others just seem to get lucky and figure it out almost right away. Chris Jones was one of these people. After going out in his uncle's plane as a kid, he just knew that he wanted to be up in the sky in some capacity. Unfortunately, at just 12 years old, he had his first seizure and was diagnosed with epilepsy. This sort of crushed his dreams of becoming a pilot because you can't get a pilot's license if you're at risk of having a seizure. Any risk of it occurring in the air is just too high. So Chris went on to pursue different things and went to university, and then when he was at university, he happened to go skydiving. Instantly, Chris's passion for being in the air was reignited, and he decided that if he couldn't fly planes, he would just jump out of them instead. Now, typically, epileptics aren't allowed to go skydiving either, but since Chris had been seizure-free for almost a decade, his doctor agreed that it would be safe for him to go. Almost right away, he signed up for a skydiving academy in Perth, Australia, where he went on to completely crush the classes. He was basically the star of the class, he aced all the tests and procedures, and all of his tandem jumps were perfect. After completing all that stuff, the next phase was to complete his first solo skydive. So far, he'd always been strapped to an instructor. So, as soon as he could, his solo skydive was scheduled and he was back up in a little Cessna airplane packed with other students as it flew over the Australian countryside. This was going to be his fifth jump as a student, but his first ever on his own. As the plane climbed to about 12,000 feet, Chris sat alone on one of the bench seats and anxiously watched a series of lights on the interior wall. Soon enough, the lights flashed green, which was the pilot's signal that they were at altitude and the skydivers were good to begin their jumps. Chris then stood up and made his way to the door where his instructor Sheldon was standing. He gave his instructor an okay, and then Sheldon opened the plane door and the wind rushed in from outside. Instantly, Chris was hit with a wave of adrenaline as he realized that this was really happening. He was really about to jump out of a plane on his own. Chris then got into the ready position at the doorway and grabbed onto the railing on the exterior of the plane. He then gave Sheldon a second okay, and Sheldon gave the signal back. Then he yelled loudly, up, down, hard arch, which is the final ready call, and then he let go of the railing and plummeted away from the aircraft. Sheldon followed him out a few seconds later and then caught up to him to visually confirm that everything was okay. As Sheldon made his way over to him, he saw that he was belly down, legs back, basically textbook falling position and the one you typically see skydivers in. From their dropout altitude of 12,000 feet, they would free fall until about 5,000 feet before they opened their parachutes. During the free fall, they'd perform some maneuvers and practice some protocols, and the first thing they needed to do was check their altimeters to make sure they were on track. Sheldon checked his first and then motioned to Chris to check his, and they both saw that they were around 10,000 feet already. Then at 9,000 feet, Sheldon gave Chris the signal for an aerial left-hand turn, which is basically like a barrel roll, over and then back to normal position again. Chris gave an okay signal and then started to make his turn, and about halfway, so now on his back, Chris just stopped and seemed to get stuck. This left him with his back toward the ground and he was no longer looking at Sheldon. Then Sheldon saw his knees start to come up towards his chest and his arms bent and started to flail wildly. Now, Sheldon was highly experienced and had done over 10,000 skydives in his career, and in all those attempts, although it was rare, students occasionally got too overwhelmed on their first solo dive and passed out. That's what Sheldon assumed was happening. Except, Chris was actually having a seizure and had completely blacked out and was now convulsing through the air. And because he had no control over his limbs, he was creating much less drag all of a sudden. Immediately upon beginning to convulse, he dropped away from Sheldon so quickly. Sheldon immediately pointed his head down to go after him, but they were now dropping much faster than they intended. They rocketed past 7,000 feet, then 6,000, then 5,000. At this point, Sheldon's altimeter started beeping to signal him to open his parachute, but Chris was still far below him. Finally, he managed to catch up to him, but he came in too fast and had to break away again. Chris continued tumbling again with Sheldon right behind him, and then Sheldon slammed into him and grabbed a hold of him. With the beeping in his helmet even louder than before, he reached across Chris's body and rolled him over. Then he pulled his ripcord and the parachute exploded from Chris's back. Immediately, Chris was ripped from Sheldon's hold and up into the air as his parachute opened. With that, Sheldon was able to breathe a sigh of relief and then pulled his own ripcord to open his own parachute. At the same time, the person on the ground had been radioing Chris for some time, but obviously Chris was non-responsive. And even though his chute had opened, he was still far off course from where the landing zone was. The person continued to give him instructions and which way to turn, but by that point had figured that Chris was likely unconscious or his radio wasn't working. Then, at about 3,000 feet, Chris slowly came to and was shocked to see that he was in the air and his parachute was open. As he lifted his head to look at it, he came to the realization that he probably blacked out, but thankfully, his training kicked in and then he went through his checklist. He checked to make sure his chute wasn't tangled, and then his altimeter, and for the first time he registered that someone was talking to him over the radio. Over the course of the next few minutes, he followed the instructions of the person on the ground and slowly made his way back on course. He got down to about 300 feet with the radio encouraging him the entire time and then made the perfect landing right on target. At that point, Sheldon was already on the ground and waiting, and Chris ran up to him and hugged him and told him that he had saved his life. Ironically, from that day forward, he hasn't had any more seizures, but unfortunately realized that he just can't risk skydiving either. Believe it or not, this was actually all caught on video. I will link that video in the description if you want to check it out. On the northeast coast of Sweden is the city of Umeå, which is the 13th largest in the country. Since the university was built in the city in the 60s, it's been growing rapidly ever since and has doubled in population several times. But despite this rapid growth, it has a relatively small population of just 130,000 people. And although the city itself looks like most other developed cities, the area around it is sparsely populated and covered in dense boreal forests. Then, because of how far north it is and how far below freezing temperature can get, a popular hobby of the people who live there is snowmobiling in these forests in the wintertime. In 2012, at the end of February, a man was on his snowmobile on one of these snowmobile tracks when he noticed a massive pile of snow just a little way off the trail. He had his helmet on and his visor down, so he couldn't quite make out what it was in the distance, so he turned around and went toward this object. As he got closer, he started to realize that it might be a car buried under all of the snow. The snow was basically all the way up to the roof, and then there was another 3-foot pile sitting on the roof on top of that. The windows were also completely iced up, so it had clearly been there for some time. The man thought to himself that this was kind of weird. He must have discovered a wrecked car or something. So he parked his snowmobile right up next to the car and then got off and waded up to the windows in the waist-deep snow. Then he went right up to the window and started scraping some of the ice off. Then, when there was a big enough hole for him to see inside, he cupped his hands against the window and looked inside. All over the interior, he could see ice caked up on the inside of the glass and the dashboard and everything else. There were also food wrappers and garbage all over the floor and seats. Then, all of a sudden, something moved in the back seat. The man was shocked to see someone lying in the back seat in a sleeping bag staring back at him through the icy window. Soon enough, emergency services were on the scene and pulling out an emaciated man who could barely move or speak. As they got him out of the car, he was so weak he could barely even communicate with them, but he would manage to get out the words, "haven't eaten and stuck here since December 19th. But that didn't really make sense. The day they were pulling him out was February the 20th. That would mean that he'd been stuck in the car for over 2 months. And for some of that time, the temperatures outside had dropped to -22 Fahrenheit or -30 Celsius. At first, this seemed completely unbelievable. But then as the man recovered in the hospital and was given fluids and food, he was able to give a full account of what had happened. Apparently, back in December, he'd been driving around on the forest trail and accidentally went too far before getting his vehicle stuck in the snow. Rather than try to walk out of the forest and try to contact someone for help, he decided to just stay in his vehicle. Initially, he used the car's heaters to keep warm, but eventually he ran out of gasoline. By that point, the car was covered in enough snow that it sort of formed an igloo around the car. He also had warm enough clothing and a sleeping bag that he was able to keep warm enough to survive. Initially as well, he had some snacks that he brought with them, but those quickly ran out, and so he had survived on melted snow for water ever since. By the time he was found by the snowmobiler, he was incredibly malnourished and succumbing to hypothermia. Basically, had he been found any later, he probably wouldn't have made it. Eventually, it was also uncovered that prior to his disappearance, he had recently broken up with his long-term girlfriend, and in addition to that, he'd managed to amass $150,000 in debt over the years. So, one day, he just decided to drive out into the woods and sort of whatever happened, happened. Investigators were also puzzled by the fact that no one had reported him missing, but apparently he'd always been sort of a recluse, so there was no one who even thought to tell anyone. During those 2 months, he'd lost a total of 50 pounds, but would make a full recovery in the hospital. There are also several pictures of the inside and outside of the car that show all the snow covering it and the frost inside of it, but I couldn't get the proper licensing for those pictures, so if you want to take a look at those, you'll find them with a quick Google search. By the early 1990s, Michael Benson had become one of Hollywood's most well-respected, well-known cameramen. He was talented and ambitious and had filmed for blockbuster hits like The Patriot Games, Terminator 2, and oddly enough, a movie called Volcano, where the main characters race against the clock to save LA from a volcano that had been triggered by an earthquake on the San Andreas Fault. But ironically, Michael's most memorable brush with a volcano came in late 1997 while filming an actual volcano for a movie called Sliver starring Sharon Stone and William Baldwin. Even as a kid, Michael Benson knew he wasn't cut out for a regular 9-to-5 job. He was the type of kid always looking for adventure and spent much of his time taking photographs of the world around him, so it was only natural that he decided to pursue a career in photojournalism. After wrapping up his education at NYU's Graduate Film School, Michael landed high-profile jobs at magazines like Rolling Stone and the New York Times before eventually deciding to head out on his own. Michael knew that he'd have more control over his own destiny as a freelance journalist, and with his impressive resume, soon enough, his choice of jobs began rolling in. Then, in mid-1997, a sequence of events that would forever change his life were set in motion when he received an unexpected call from an executive at Paramount Pictures. What Paramount needed for the closing scenes of the movie they were filming was dramatic aerial footage of one of the world's most active and unpredictable volcanoes, known as the Pu'u'o'o crater, located in the southeast corner of the Big Island of Hawaii. Towering at nearly 3,000 feet above sea level for more than a decade, the crater had racked up a reputation for leveling homes, long stretches of coastal highway, and sending locals fleeing from their homes in the area. Michael knew that shooting from a helicopter for such a dangerous environment was risky, but he'd already done similar work, and that was also sort of part of the fun of the job. Confident he could pull it off and excited about how it might add to his already impressive resume, Michael immediately reached out to film technician Chris Duddy to see if he was up for the challenge. Chris was also interested, and Paramount thought the potential rewards far outweighed the risks, and with the movie's release date approaching, things began falling into place. Michael and Chris arrived in Hawaii a few days before the scheduled shoot in late November and promptly met with pilot Craig Hosking to come up with a game plan and familiarize themselves with the helicopter from which they'd be working. Then, on November 27th, they made a last-minute stop at a local liquor store to pick up a bottle of gin, and a few hours later, the trio lifted off and headed for the crater. The flight was relatively short and uneventful, and after a quick circle over the target area, Craig eased the helicopter down into the crater so Chris could uphold a local tradition. At just the right moment, Chris smiled at the other two and then tossed the bottle of gin into the crater as an offering to Madame Pele, the goddess of fire and creation in Hawaiian religion and mythology. But almost like a bad omen for things to come, Chris missed the pool of molten lava and the bottle came to rest by the crater's wall a few feet away. All of a sudden, Craig started to struggle to control the helicopter in unpredictable wind gusts and poor visibility caused by hydrogen and sulfur vapors wafting up from the volcano. Seconds later, Michael and Chris heard Craig yell over the intercom that they had a serious problem. Looking up through the haze, they were shocked that the sheer wall of the crater was directly in front of them, and in an instant, the helicopter was rocked by a violent shudder as the rotor tip slammed into volcanic rock. Now just 20 feet over the crater floor, the helicopter crashed downward and was ripped into 3 pieces, barely missing a pool of lava that would have burned all 3 of the men alive. Incredibly, despite the suddenness and violence of the accident, as they picked themselves up out of the dust cloud, all 3 of the men were surprised to find that they were all alive and sustained only minor injuries. Seconds later, though, they realized that even though the impact hadn't killed them, they were now trapped near the bottom of an active volcano. Surrounded by pools of superheated lava and clouded by noxious vapors, they were about 200 feet from the crater's surface, which were essentially cliffs of rock and sand. Unfortunately, they had no way of knowing if anyone knew the helicopter had even gone down. And if authorities were aware of the crash, there was no telling how long it would take to mount a rescue. They couldn't just wait indefinitely in a volcano. Either way, it was clear that they have to take matters into their own hands. Now in the late morning, Chris and Michael spent nearly 2 hours trying to climb their way out, while Craig stayed behind to repair the helicopter's radio to call for help. But despite struggling desperately up the sheer walls, they made barely any progress because with each foot they gained, the loose volcanic rock crumbled under the weight and sent them sliding down to their original starting points. Finally, through sheer determination, the 2 of them managed to figure out a strategy to make progress without sliding so far back down. Michael eventually made it to a narrow outcropping of rock about 100 feet below the crater's rim, and Chris managed to get even higher before stopping to catch his breath to consider his options. In their efforts to climb out, the 2 of them had sort of split off in different directions, and although they were just 50 feet from one another, neither of them could see or hear the other through the vapor clouds and the crackling of the volcano. Worse yet, they weren't even sure if the other was still alive. They also ended up kind of trapped in inaccessible positions in a particularly unstable portion of the crater. And although they were so close to the rim, their locations were completely obscured by low-level clouds and the vapor. Thankfully, although they didn't know it, tons of rescuers had already arrived on scene and were making a plan to save them. Then, while they sat on their little rock ledges, the two of them began to hear the sound of helicopter blades somewhere above the vapor clouds. First, rescuers contemplating using a helicopter to hover over the area and hoist them out, but with strong wind gusts and rain blowing in from the coast, they feared that attempting to save them via helicopter might result in another crash and possibly even fatalities. At the same time, ground-based rescuers were dealing with their own issues. Excessive movement from above could send rocks and cinders down on top of them, and the rescuers weren't even sure where they were. The only thing they had to work off of was a guess based on where the helicopter wreckage was. At the same time as well, Chris and Michael repeatedly yelled down to Craig, but hearing no reply, they feared he might have succumbed to noxious gases or had fallen into one of the lava pits on the crater floor. At the crater rim, even though they couldn't see either of the two men, rescuers blew whistles and yelled down, hoping that if they were nearby, it would be enough to give them hope of being rescued soon. But the hope of a quick rescue waned as the afternoon dragged into the evening, and Michael and Chris prepared themselves for a long, cold, and miserable night. Now in basically complete dark, other than the dim light given off by the lava, all they heard were the hissing vapors and gusting winds as they sat on their little ledges. It gave their already terrible situation an almost otherworldly feel. Then, adding insult to injury, the temperature dropped and they were intermittently pelted by cold rain. At some point in the night, in a cruel twist of irony, they began to think that they might die of hypothermia inside of an active volcano. Thankfully, both men somehow survived the night, but by sunrise, they were in terrible shape mentally and physically. Although they had heard the helicopter blades the day prior, they still had no clear indication that a rescue was ongoing. That morning, Chris decided to make a last desperate attempt to climb out of the volcano. He said a quick prayer, yelled over to Michael, waited for a reply that never came, and then began climbing as hard as he could toward the edge. Getting a solid foothold and making progress was still difficult, but he figured out that he could prevent himself from backsliding by digging his elbows into the cinders. At one point, as he climbed, he dislodged a large chunk of rock that rocketed down into the crater and just barely missed Michael. At the same time, Michael couldn't see what had caused the rockfall, but assumed that it was Chris falling to his death from somewhere above him. In the end, it took Chris almost 6 hours to cover the last 100 feet, and at approximately 2:30 p.m. on Sunday the 28th, 27 hours after the crash, he heaved himself up and over the rim to the surprise of nearby rescuers. Michael's situation, on the other hand, just continued to get worse. He had lost all hope of being rescued, his anxiety was giving him panic attacks, and he started to have hallucinations. While some of the auditory hallucinations may have been voices of the rescuers above, others seemed to be taunts from the volcano itself. Others were even heartbreaking messages from friends and family pleading with him not to give up. To distract himself, Michael prayed, recited the alphabet backward, and tried to capture the rain in his hands to quench his thirst. At one point, in complete frustration, he stood up and screamed into the volcano that he wouldn't let it take his life. But, like his attempts to communicate with Chris and Craig earlier, he was only met with silence. Then, there was an unexpected break in the weather. All of a sudden, Michael looked up and there was a helicopter flying above him. He stood up and waved his arms wildly as the helicopter seemed to try to get into position. But almost as quickly as the clouds had dissipated, they rolled in once again and completely obscured the view of Michael down on the ledge. With his target out of sight, the pilot held the helicopter as steady as he could while the technician lowered the rescue basket down through the haze. After giving Michael what they thought was enough time to crawl in, the basket was slowly winched up from the cloud. Finally, it lifted into view and they were ecstatic to see that it wasn't empty. Michael later described the short trip out of the crater as the ride of his life. During that time, he found out that Chris had managed to climb his way out, and Craig had been rescued as well the day prior when they first heard the helicopter. Upon hearing this, he turned back toward the volcano to let it know that he and his colleagues had won. Michael was later treated for a number of minor injuries, including laryngitis and inflammation of the lungs, and Paramount Pictures later released the movie the following year with a different ending that didn't require aerial footage of the volcano. Although it's not entirely clear why the helicopter crashed in the first place, it's likely that the engine stalled after taking in vapors from the crater, or the gas had thinned the air to such an extent that the rotors couldn't create enough lift to keep it in the air. According to the local park service, the rescue effort cost nearly $50,000, and it's rumored that Paramount Pictures picked up some or all of the tab. Hello everyone, my name is Sean and welcome to Scary Interesting. Depending on how much all of you enjoyed this video, I'm thinking of turning this into an entire series, because there's no shortage of insane survival stories that don't quite fit the length for a standalone video. So let me know in the comments if this is something you want to see more of, or if you don't want to see more of. Again, thank you all so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.